So here we are for the after-school review for the role of women throughout the course of American history. And as I've said, as we're saying, so it's on video for those who watch tonight. They'll make sure they know this Thursday when we have our FRQ. This may or perhaps will be a strong part of what the FRQ is. For tomorrow's FRQ, I'll give you a hint. Think early 20th century. How's that? Is that a good hint? 1900 to about 1920s. If you think about that time period. Right? So that'll give you a hint. And we have a videotape. So those who weren't here for the review, hopefully they're going to watch tonight. Pointing at you guys. Should be watching. I don't want to have like 18 hits again. It's like sad. All right, so there you go. And for those of you who aren't in my class, you're just watching this. Hey. All right, so the role of women. All right, so we'll think of early colonial. Remember, when Jamestown is first founded, when those first ships show up, say that 5 times fast. There are no women in 1607. It's all men. Later on, by 1608, 1609, 1610, women are coming. Women are coming. In the beginning, though, they don't play a huge role in anything because of the culture of Europe. Women have no rights. Women are treated as second-class citizens. In America, well, let's look at Pocahontas. Now, everyone thinks of Pocahontas because of the Disney cartoon, running around already as an adult woman, speaking to raccoons and a talking tree. No. They also think that she, is somehow in love with John Smith. No, she's 12. That would really be bad. On a lot of levels, that would be bad. So that's not happening. But she is very important early on in our history. Because of the adoption ceremony, it's actually an adoption ceremony that takes place with Chief Powhatan, John Smith. Pocahontas is his daughter. She can become an interpreter. They bring her into the camp, and we start having this interchange now between the Indians and the English that are coming over. She acts as an interpreter. Later on, as she does get a little older, she will marry a John, but not John Smith. John Rolfe. What does her marriage wind up doing? Anybody remember why that's important? It ends something. It ends something violent. It ends a war. The first Anglo-Powhatan wars come to an end. 1610 to 1614. Remember, Lord De La Warr had come over in 1610. Thomas West. Remember, Lord De La Warr is a title. What state is named after that?
Delaware.
Delaware. So that marriage, around what, 1614 I believe it is, that brings an end to that war. She marries John Rolfe, the guy who brings tobacco basically to the colonies. She gets baptized in the Anglican Church. Does anybody remember her Christian name now? You're shaking your head yes?
Rebecca.
Rebecca. She's Rebecca. But this is very important. This is a very important moment in English Native American relations. Of course, they go back to England where she gets sick, and unfortunately she does die very young, and it brings back another war. A lot of hostility will happen. But again, more women are coming over here, but because in Virginia, the Chesapeake area, the water's not that good. There's a lot of swamp area, a lot of mosquitoes, a lot of malaria. There's a lot of fighting other Indian groups. That the death rate amongst men, pretty high. Pretty high. And it did not lead to a tight-knit continuity in the family. Oftentimes you can have 2 people get married, and the wife, childbirth is an iffy thing to begin with, and let's say the wife dies in childbirth. So now the father's left with a son. Well, he's immediately going to try and get remarried, and he does. He gets remarried to help raise this child. Now with his new wife, He has 2 more children, but then he dies of, well, our favorite thing ever, dysentery. Exactly, dysentery. Now you have a widow who has 2 children from her husband and this son from another marriage that wasn't really hers. She remarries. By the time this young boy grows up, he might not know who his real parents were or his grandparents, so there's no family continuity going on. But the women are gaining land rights in the South because of this. Because of the high death rate, Virginia and then some of the other southern colonies will start to say, we'll allow women to have land rights if the husband dies. However, she loses all said land rights when what? She remarries. That's how George Washington became the richest man in America. He married the richest widow in America. She had thousands of acres of land, Martha, and he marries her and then he inherits all that. Now in the North, in the New England area, they do not give land rights to women. Do you remember why? They were afraid of something. They might divorce. It might lead to a divorce rate. But they did give certain rights to women. Abusive. Yeah, husbands can't be abusive. If you're abusive, you could take your husband to court. So women's rights, in a very, very obviously small, almost insignificant way, starts though in the Americas. You don't have this in Europe. You have it beginning here in America. Anne Hutchinson, she's a specific woman in the in the Massachusetts area. In the 1630s, she dissents against Puritan orthodoxy. Their main teaching is predestination. The idea that you're one of the elect, you're going to heaven. The reprobate, you're going to hell automatically before you're even born. She begins to preach antinomianism, right, against the law. So she is the first, like, feminist, some people will say in America. She speaks out against the church and its leading and its leaders. They put her on trial. They find out that she knows the Bible better than they do. So they immediately start building a school. Harvard. They start building Harvard. Now, they're already going to build Harvard, but this is really going to move them towards this. This woman challenges them, and she knows the Bible better. But antinomianism, she also preaches the idea of the Holy Spirit being a prominent role in life, which really wasn't part of Puritan teaching in the beginning. But by the Great Awakening, almost 100 years later, her teachings will eventually start to influence the church. And they'll start to think about the Holy Spirit a little bit more. Predestination starts to fade into the background. But again, for most colonial early life, women were in the background. Right? It's just what it is. Right? Men took a lead in everything. Women are second-class citizens at best. Their role is to basically have children and raise children. Any education in the household is in the sphere of influence of the woman. Then we move on to the Revolutionary period. You have this Great Awakening I mentioned. The beginning of religious pluralism. The beginning of moving away from the idea of going to college and getting a degree in order to be a religious minister. The Holy Spirit takes on a stronger influence. Women start taking an active role in religion because women are, by nature, more spiritual than men are. So preachers would often influence the women of their congregation to, in fact, influence the family. Now this is 1740s, 1730s, 1740s. You have Jonathan Edwards and Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. But this starts to begin Americans challenging authority, Americans taking a more active role in their life, and it gave a sense of enfranchisement a little bit to women as well. Then we move into the Revolutionary period. Mercy Otis Warren. You have, after the French Indian War happens, right? The French Indian War comes and goes. Americans start to feel like they're a bigger part of the British Empire. British don't feel that way. They start to make Americans pay taxes, and eventually, one thing to the next, we get into revolution. But during that time period, women start taking more of an active role as well. When they start doing boycotts, non-importation agreements, they turn to the women of society to make clothes at home for the cause, make candles, to make soap. This becomes very important. They become an active part of this protesting that's taking place. Now, they weren't like the Sons of Liberty, obviously, going out there and torching things, but they do take a more active role in the creation of America. Mercy is our first historian. Her family, very prominent Bostonian family. She's the one in 1768, when she sees the troops coming in from Halifax, Nova Scotia. She famously says, "This is a day that will forever live in infamy." Which FDR copped it. We know it as FDR's famous Pearl Harbor speech. And maybe he didn't know about this speech, I don't know, but it just seems kind of funny. They both said the same thing. But as the revolution takes place, do women take an active role in the revolution? I'm seeing some people shake their head yes. Can you think of certain incidences where this happened? There's a famous woman, who's actually, it's a nickname for a woman, happened on the battlefield, Molly Pitcher. Molly Pitcher. Right? That's not the real name of an actual woman. That was more of a nickname. On the battlefield, women are there bringing pitchers of water, as men are fighting. So they're Molly Pitchers. And there's this one incident of one particular woman. Her husband was manning cannons, and when he is shot dead, she supposedly took over the cannon and maybe fired at least one round at the British. So that kind of then she comes to symbolize all these Molly Pitchers. But women often were there with the men as they traveled. Right? They took care of their clothing, they cooked for them. There were some other women who went around to make sure the men were happy for other reasons. But they're starting to take more of an active role. They're starting to get more involved. And as the war comes to an end, the idea of the Republican motherhood, right? We're leaving monarchy behind. All the children prior to 1776, born under a king. From 1776 onward, you're born in a republic. So women take on an elevated role. Men, in their minds, they put women up on a pedestal at this moment. And women are going to teach virtual republicanism to the new children. A whole generation of Americans are about to be born, and it's up to the women of the country to see to it that they know what the Republican motherhood is. So women have a very active role in that, as far as the men are concerned. But they still do not have what?
Right.
What type of rights specifically? Voting rights. There's no voting rights yet. Right? They're forming a new government, and they're going to start to allow a representative government where men will vote. But what kind of men are voting early republic? White land-owning men. There's also some religious requirements at times as well to be a voter. In some of the states, they made you had to be part of a religion. But eventually with the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause of religion, they start to abolish that. Abigail Adams has a famous quote. When she heard about the Declaration of Independence, all men created equal, she writes to her famous husband, John, "Remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. We are determined to foment a rebellion." Now, it's tongue-in-cheek a little bit what she's writing. You know what I mean by that? Ever heard that expression? I know it's an old man's expression, and I'm an old man. There's a little bit of humor in this. Her and her husband, John, constantly are writing back and forth. Abigail Adams was more than just a wife to John. She was an equal partner to John Adams. Right? So he would often bounce ideas off of her. She would, tell him what she was thinking. She was very well read. But even though there's a little humor, I mean, we're determined to foment a rebellion, like a woman's rebellion all of a sudden. thousands of women marching with pitchforks and, you know, guns, and yeah, not going to happen. But in this humor, she is also telling John a little something, right? All men created equal. What about women? Don't forget us. We want rights too. She's like the first American woman to really go on record and talk about specific rights. You could make an argument that maybe she's talking about voting rights. We don't know exactly, but you know, she's going on record for this. Hey, John, you're writing this nice declaration, and later on you're going to form a government. Make sure that women get something. Throw us a bone here every now and again. And of course they don't. John Adams kind of laughs this off. The founding fathers laugh at these things. Oh, ha, 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 ha. Yeah, Republican motherhood. That's where you guys are, right? That's your role. Leave the thinking to the men. It's a sad commentary of the way people thought, but that's the way people thought in that time period. Even the majority of women in that time period will tell you the same thing. All right, so we get into this new era. We go through nation building. And then we get to this idea, the age of Jackson and mass democracy, market revolutions are happening, the republic is emerging. We get one of the biggest social changes in American history with the Second Great Awakening. Starts off as a religious movement. It's definitely a religious movement. Women take a more active role in this awakening than they did in the First Great Awakening. In fact, men like Charles Finley, is one of the leading voices of this. He's the first guy to start inviting women up onto stage to testify about their faith. He invites the Grimke sisters up on stage to talk about slavery in the South, because he's also going to be an abolitionist. So women are taking a more and more active role in our society. A lot of things are happening. All are happening right around the same time, as a market revolution is taking place. In Lowell, Massachusetts, they decide on an experiment. Why don't we allow women to work in the factory? Over a few decades, you know, hundreds, perhaps thousands of women will have gone through this factory system, textile mills, learning how to operate a loom, one of the most technological advanced instruments, tools of its time period. And women get a sense of enfranchisement again. They get a sense of empowerment. They're able to control their own economic destiny. Now these are young girls, but they are clearly influenced by this, and they start to like this little bit of power. Now they'll eventually be replaced by the 1840s with Irish immigrants. But it's like the beginning of giving women a sense of their own independence, economically speaking. At the same time, we're trying to tell women that they live in what we call the cult of domesticity. Your sphere of influence is the house. You need to be home, cooking, cleaning, educating the children, having children. That's your sphere of influence. With the Second Great Awakening happening and a market revolution happening, women in the know, women educated enough to understand these things, begin to use cult of domesticity kind of against their husbands and say, wait a second, if it's my role to make sure the household is well adjusted, our children are going up in a nice atmosphere, a nice environment, should I not then be involved in some of these social reforms that are taking place? For the betterment of our home, of course, so our children have a happier world. Temperance movements, abolition movement, education reform, prison reform. Who's the woman that's involved in prison and asylum? Dorothea Dix. Now Dorothea Dix, in order to get done what she needed to get done, she stayed out of suffrage. Because she knew that if she went to men and tried to get men to pass laws, yeah, exactly, to reform prisons, and they thought of her as a suffragist, they wouldn't listen to her. Now, of course she wants women voting rights, but she stayed out of that particular category. But women crossed over. Women who were pro-abolition also obviously became pro-suffrage. Women who were for temperance movements were also pro-education reform. So women began to become very involved in society and told their husbands, look, this is the cult of domesticity. You want us to take care of the home, how better take care of the home and make sure we have a safe social environment that we all live in. And then we get to Seneca Falls, right, 1848, upstate New York. The Declaration, Sentiments, and Resolutions, right? What is it modeled after? Declaration of Independence. Right? How many of you read that in your English classes as well? Yes, yes, I thought so. Right? Very big thing. I always like that in the AP English and AP History. We get a lot of crossover that way. Here again is this moment, you know, a declaration for women. Equal rights. All men and women are created equal. Who's the leading woman here? Elizabeth Cady Stanton. A younger woman coming on the scene is Susan B. Anthony, who will eventually lead the charge later on. But again, women are going to take a very active role. A lot of men will also be here. A lot of people will sign the declaration, but over the ensuing weeks that happen afterwards, some of them will want their names taken off because of pressure. Right? Society puts a lot of pressure on people at this time. They're not sure that this is a right thing. And so some people, out of fear of retribution, retaliation, want their names scratched off with the declaration. And so some people will. So the Civil War and post-Civil War. During the Civil War, women who were suffragists were basically told by Lincoln and others, look, we need you to support the war. When the war is over, we can go back and look at this thing for voting rights for women. Of course, then Lincoln's assassinated. Things begin to change dramatically within the Republican Party, and they do not get their voting rights. Free slaves, free black men will get voting rights in what amendment?
15.
The 15th Amendment. 15th Amendment. There's no restriction on there for gender to open it up for women. But after the Civil War, it didn't mean that women just went and hid into the background. There are a lot of very active women at this time period. You have everything from the writers, Louise May Alcott, right? She's wrote Little Women. Emily Dickinson, a famous poet at the time period. So you have a lot of women are getting involved in literature. You have activists who will grow. This is a time period of the Gilded Age, which bleeds into the Progressive era. It's almost, they almost push each other along. Mary Elizabeth Lease, a populist, one of the leading voices of the populist movement. Less corn and more hell, boys. Although there's some doubt if she actually said those words, but they're often equated to her. The idea of telling the farmers who really controls things. If farmers stopped growing food, America would have to listen, right? So she is one of the leading activists at the time. She's a lecturer. She's a writer. She's an activist. After the populist movement falls apart, she eventually gets into the progressive movement. Famously, when she's from Kansas, when she goes to Congress to meet members of Congress, and people will introduce her to congressmen saying, well, this is Mary Elizabeth Lease. Men would put their hands in their pockets. They didn't want to shake her hand. That's how important she became in her time period. Of course, unfortunately, one of these forgotten famous women that, you know, because his story, only men seem to write history, but women have a huge role in this now. Jane Addams. This is the beginning of progressivism. All the immigrants, the new immigrants are coming to America. They have no sense of democracy. They don't know how to assimilate. They're being taken advantage of by what machinery? The political machinery. Right? They're highly taken advantage of. They live in slums, in tenement homes in the major cities, and Adams and others start to create what? Settlement homes. Her settlement home was called Hull House. That's just the name of the building she had. It was a mansion that she bought. But they're known as settlement homes. She was very big on this, on helping immigrants to assimilate into American culture. Teaching them how to read and write English, daycare so that they can go find jobs, help them find jobs, help them find a place to live after a while, social activities, try to help immigrants to really assimilate to American culture. This is the beginning of a progressive movement in America. And women like Jane Addams were at the forefront of this. Jane Addams, the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And for doing so, the Daughters of the American Revolution kicked her out. I guess you can't have a peace prize and be in the Daughters of the American Revolution, I guess. She's also the first woman to officially nominate somebody for the President of the United States. She officially nominated Theodore Roosevelt in the election of 1912. She made the official nomination speech for him. So that's a first as well. There were adventurers at this time period. We didn't really talk a lot about gunslingers in the Old West. Calamity Jane, a real person. She was a scout for George Custer. And she could have been at the Battle of Little Bighorn, but she had gotten sick earlier and didn't make it on that trip. But she was a famous scout. She was romantically involved with Wild Bill Hickok, another famous gunslinger of the time period. Have you ever heard of Annie Oakley? Yeah. The play Annie Get Your Gun? Annie Oakley was a circus act. Okay? Calamity Jane was the real deal. But then like Clara Barton, right? She was a nurse during the Civil War. She was very disgusted over the terrible medical practices of the day, sawing off arms and legs right there in the open, men screaming bloody murder, taking that same saw and walking over and sawing off the next guy. Don't clean it, don't wash your hands. She began to see just how gross this is. She went to Europe, and what did she get involved with in Europe? The Red Cross. Then she comes to America, she comes back, and she's one of the founders of the American Red Cross. Right? So a very, very important person also, Clara Barton. So you can see that after the Civil War, women are getting much more involved politically, socially, economically. They still have no enfranchisement. They're still not given the right to vote. Unless, of course, you live way out in the western states. There's not enough people there. There's more sheep than there are people. So you have to give women the right to vote. In Wyoming, in Montana, they have the right to vote out there. But in the eastern part, up to the Mississippi, not a lot of voting rights. There's no national voting rights yet for women. I also want to throw in here, because this is something I've not mentioned before, during the Gilded Age, an artist by the name of Gibson creates this idealistic image of women. It's known as the Gibson Girls. Go figure that the magazines of the day would have this way of taunting or flaunting what we think a woman should look like. Right? A magazine image of the independent and athletic new woman of the Gilded Age. The typewriter and the telephone switchboard has been invented by this time, and women are starting to find employment in these fields as telephone switch operators, as secretaries on the typewriter. So we saw new economic and social opportunities do emerge as well during the Gilded Age for women. And women start, if they want to have a job now, it is for their pure economic reasons for themselves. This is slowly starting to emerge with America. But still we want to give this idea of what a woman should look like. A very feminine, small waist. How do they achieve the small waist look? Corsets, right? They had to try them and tighten. Every time I've ever seen that in a movie, I just cringe. I just don't know how anyone could have wore that. But that became the image of what people thought women should look like. Suffering until suffrage. the turn of the century, the 20th century, an enlightened century, but women still don't have the right to vote. Alice Paul. Alice Paul comes on the scene. She's a young girl. She's learned some of the more radical elements of suffrage out of England. She brings us back to America, and she tells the older women who are around, we can't just be docile anymore. We have to really get in there and mix it up. What are they doing here in this picture? Anybody remember? What is this? It's the White House. What are they doing? Protesting. This is Woodrow Wilson's in the White House. Do you remember what's going on at the time?
World War I.
World War I. Up until World War I, no one protested a president while a war was going on. And they said, this is our chance. He's talking about make the world safe for democracy, and yet women don't have the right to vote. They're calling him Kaiser Wilson. You can't read it, that's really small for you, but they're calling him out as Kaiser Wilson. What happens to Alice Paul? You saw that movie clip. She goes on, well, she gets arrested first. First she gets arrested, sent to a prison in Virginia, and there she goes on a hunger strike. Everyone's trying to keep this a secret. This doesn't look good if you're President of the United States and you have these basically political prisoners locked away, these women, and they're now going on hunger strikes. And then we find out while she's on a hunger strike, they're force feeding her. It doesn't look good. Eventually she's let free. And eventually, Woodrow Wilson, who did not want to give suffrage rights to women, he didn't really believe in that, but his hand is kind of forced. So he puts his weight behind the 19th Amendment. And eventually, through a lot of compromise, a lot of arguing with congressmen and senators, eventually it wins out. And the 19th Amendment is passed. And women finally get the right to vote. What year? 1920. 1920. Jeanette Rankin, the first woman elected to Congress. Now, she was elected to Congress before the 19th Amendment because she's out from the western states. Right? She's out from the western states. I believe it's Montana. Do you remember what she's famous for doing? She voted no on both wars. She votes no for World War I. Now, there were actually a group of men who voted no. It wasn't just her. But she felt for the legacy of women that she's going to leave behind. For young girls to look at the first time a woman got into political office and could have a real vote on war, she should vote no. She voted her conscience. She's a one-term member of Congress. Well, until 1940, she finally wins her second term. And what happens in 41?
World War II.
Well, Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Yeah, World War II is already going on, and America is now going to enter World War II, and she votes no again. This time she's the only voice to vote no, and again loses her re-election bid. But again, she's setting what she thinks is a precedent for women, that if women could vote no for war, they should vote no. We get the triangular shirtwaist fire that happened early on during President Taft's administration. And there's this school teacher who came out to watch it, Frances Perkins. And she's horrified over these women who are basically jumping to their death, trying to get away from that fire. She realizes that there are no safe working conditions in New York City for the women that work in all these factories. 3-story, 7-story, 10-story buildings. She starts to pressure the city of New York. Eventually she becomes the head of the public safety committees. And then when FDR becomes president, we've moved from Alice Paul and the voting rights. We now have women who are going to be elected in Congress. He appoints her as the first female cabinet member. FDR does, yeah. First woman to sit on the cabinet. So progress is being made, but it's slow going. There's still a lot of other things out there that are happening. investigative journalists in the, or again, early 1900s. You have the muckrakers. Ida Tarbell is a very famous investigative journalist. She took on Standard Oil. Who is the great robber baron of Standard Oil? Oil. Who is the oil baron? Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller. This breaks up his monopoly. We get Exxon and Mobil is created. Ida B. Wells. See, the names are very similar, right? Ida M. Tarbell. I M. Tarbell. And Ida B. Wells. I. B. Wells. I always love those little initials. Now, do you notice something different about?
She's black.
Yes, here's a black investigative reporter. Very important. She writes pamphlets about lynching. Remember, lynching was legal in southern states. And lynching is what? Hanging without trial. You just hang somebody. So here she begins to write these pamphlets. Her most famous one is Southern Horrors. Right? She goes over to England. She brings her pamphlet over there and speaks to the people of England as well. She tours Europe. Right? She gets a lot of attention for what's happening in America. Today, we would call this human rights violations. Right? These are human rights violations. Black Americans are suffering under Jim Crow law. Right? Jim Crow law, segregation, lynching without trials, and she draws attention to this. It's going to be a long time before a president's able to be brave enough, because he's always afraid of losing Democratic support, to sign anti-lynching bills. So she's the journalist that brings that out. She's a muckraker. Ida Tarbell's a muckraker, exposing the ills of society in general. The Roaring Twenties. All types of social and political changes for women in society, now with the right to vote. Margaret Sanger, birth control. This is highly taboo. She came under scrutiny of the Comstock law. Remember the Comstock law? Obscenity, what is pornography, what is obscenity? Right? She's in trouble for this. Because she writes a book, What Every Girl Should Know. Talking about young girls, what happens to them when they go through puberty. But she's a doctor. And she's going to fight hard for your right to understand these things. She's going to fight hard for the idea of birth control. People should understand, how do you get pregnant? You'd be surprised at how many times people don't really know the birds and the bees talk. So she's one of the first real activists in this area. Of course, this is the time period of the young emancipated girl, the flappers. They begin to cut their hair short in what's called a bob, smoke cigarettes in public. They flaunted all social norms. They stopped wearing those corsets of their grandmother and mother and began to wear, loose-fitting baby doll dresses. Really got out there during the time of Prohibition. They were drinking alcohol. Here's somebody I've never really mentioned to you. Amy Simple McPherson. A big-time personality in this time period. Radio evangelist. We've talked about televangelists later on in the 1970s and 80s. She was a radio evangelist. She said the United States was founded by divine inspiration. What famous document going back to the 1630s Jonathan Edwards, City Upon a Hill, right? Divine inspiration. This becomes the backbone for evangelism all the way through our time period. She has, in fact, influenced evangelism ever since the 1920s. She's a very important person when it comes to religion in America. She will attack Darwinism. She will attack the Scope trials. Remember the Scope trials? when John T. Scott went on trial for teaching biology and evolution in Tennessee. Remember that?
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Right? She goes on the radio. In fact, you can't probably really see it. It's a Bible and a monkey she's holding in her hands. Right? The Bible is more important than evolution. So she attacks all of these things. And she made, again, evangelism very, very popular in America. We get into the World War II era. We can do it. Do what?
Beat the Nazis.
Are you talking about women, David?
Like,
What can they do? What are they going to do during this time period? They're going to take the jobs that the men leave behind. What do we collectively call women? All working on these jobs.
The riveters?
Rosie the Riveter. Right, Rosie the Riveter. Did they take those jobs?
yes.
Yes, by the millions. They built the tanks, the trucks, the jeeps, the battleships, the airplanes. Women did these jobs. This is probably the single most important poster of World War II. We can do it. Desperate for women to get into these fields so that men could go and fight the war. Wonder Woman as a cartoon, as a comic book, is developed at this time period. This doctor, who is also the inventor of the lie detector test. You guys remember anything about Wonder Woman and her magic lasso of truth, forces you to tell the truth? He's the inventor of the lie detector test. He understood that women needed, young girls needed an icon to look up to, just like young boys would have what? Superman. 1938 is Superman, 1939 is Batman. The war breaks out. Comic books take on a huge emphasis for young people getting involved in the war, a means of escapism. Young girls who are staying home, they now have their own idol to look up to, Wonder Woman. She is just as strong, just as fast as Superman. Of course, she doesn't have all those other silly powers he has. Freeze breath. Freeze breath, that's just weird. After the war is over, a new cult of domesticity. We got to make sure that women leave those jobs and conform to the 50s. They must conform during this time period. The 50s is always about conformity. You have all these television shows of the time period are all about the family and the structure of the family. The Donna Reed show, To Leave It to Beaver, to Father Knows Best, Ozzie and Harriet, there's always a simple, simple thing to understand. Mom stays home wearing a dress at all times and does the cooking and the cleaning. Father goes to work in a suit and tie, and he comes home and solves all problems. The typical TV suburban life of conformity. A new cult of domesticity emerges. And what better way to promote this than through television? Everybody loves television. Everybody gets in front of their TV and just vegetates. And this is being blasted to your brain constantly, constantly, constantly. And then we get into the time period now. The feminist mystique. Who wrote that book? Betty Friedan. This is Betty Friedan right here. The feminist mystique. This is Gloria Steinem. She becomes the leader of the women's movement during the 1960s. She created a magazine called Ms. Ms. The first issue of Ms. magazine had Wonder Woman on the cover. Right? Female empowerment. This is Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman to be elected to Congress, 1968. She'll be a member of Congress from 1968 to 1983. She's the first person, first black American, I should say, who gets nominated to run for President of the United States for a major political party, 1972. And she's the first woman then who also runs for a major political party in 1972. The first woman appointed to Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor, appointed by Ronald Reagan. Now, the role of women have changed dramatically, but we still live in an era of the glass ceiling effect. Right? Women still aren't completely enfranchised in this country. What is it the saying that for every dollar a man makes, a woman can make 75 cents? So there's still a lot of struggle, but for the most part, women are much more of an active force in society. More so than ever before. Hillary Clinton ran for President of the United States and came very close to winning that nomination. She may do it again. I think we're getting very close to a moment where we can be very accepting to a female president now. And I think that's very good for your generation, very good for what's happening in America now. All right, so that brings an end to this lecture, the role of women in America. Yes, please applaud. I like applause. It makes me feel good. Part of my own self-aggrandizement moment, my ego, my head. Oh, please, more. All right, we'll cut it off right there.